Canary Wharf was a sort of offshore island, completely divorced from the rest of Britain.
I had a good look at what SCM was doing in my day. The question really was how aggressively it should be grown. My view was it should not be grown very aggressively, because you could only grow it aggressively by pushing the envelope too far.
Now, critics would say that Martin Taylor always opposed a major expansion of the investment bank. It was the main reason he left. And after he went, the SCM department did expand dramatically.
This company.
We've been given confidential documents which show the shape of one SCM tax avoidance scheme.
Barclays sits there. That's the Luxembourg bank. That's the finance.
Staff lent billions of pounds to a bank in Luxembourg via complex structures and a company in the Cayman Islands.
Down at the bottom here, we've still got our £2.5 billion.
Barclays drew up the whole structure.
It's like some sort of nightmare IKEA map.
Somehow, all of this helped Barclays exploit the system and avoid millions in tax.
There's something else here, which has got 120 million of dividend. And there's Barclays up at the top.
Barclays told us it does not offer, condone or support unlawful tax evasion. Where any SCM transaction has UK tax implications, we make full and explicit disclosure to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Inside Barclays Investment Bank, SCM was a closed world, but we've tracked down an insider. As long as we protected his identity, he agreed to tell us about this little-known tax avoidance department.
It was isolated. The whole section had about 100 people, including support staff, so there were about 60 people on the front end. They made huge profits.
Much of their work was about finding new ways of avoiding tax.
Some very smart people in the product development team would come up with a tax trick, and the marketing team would cloak it in some kind of rationale. Some tax structuring is common in a lot of banks, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly normal. The issue was that they turned it into an industry within the bank. We used to say to ourselves at the time, how does a bank get away with this stuff?
SCM paid some of Barclays' biggest bonuses. We've been told the bonus pool was 10% of profits, which would mean in its best year, 100 people shared £100 million. Barclays says our figures are inaccurate. But over the weekend, Barclays announced SCM will close. The bank is expected to say it will no longer engage in activities where the main objective is to access tax benefits. Which brings us to the biggest deal of all. Back in 2008, Barclays was in trouble. It looked like they might have to ask for a government bailout.
In 2008, the whole world banking system was in crisis, and the British banks in particular were in terrible trouble. Barclays, perfectly reasonably, were desperate to avoid a rescue.
So why was Barclays keen to stay out of government control when other banks were bailed out? Well, Barclays has made much of the fact that it remained independent, but some say there's another reason, the same old reason: bonuses.
They were prepared to do anything to avoid going to the taxpayer, because that would have required limits on bonuses. It would have undermined the culture that Bob Diamond was known for.
Do you think bonuses were a factor in this?
I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was. But I don't believe it was the only reason.
But it was a factor?
It must have been.
Barclays deny bonuses were a factor. They had been told, like all banks, to increase the amount of their reserves. By October 2008, they found themselves with just a couple of weeks to find the cash. We've been told they went to some surprising places to try and get it. Like Libya. This was when Colonel Gaddafi was still in charge. We've been told Barclays asked the Libyan Investment Authority if it wanted to buy a slice of the bank. One of the men who ran the Libyan fund told Panorama that they turned Barclays down because the deal was too rushed and too risky. Barclays say this is inaccurate, that they had no need for funding from Libya. In the end, it didn't matter. Two other groups in the Middle East were happy to provide the cash. £7 billion, mainly from the Gulf states of Qatar and Abu Dhabi. It came at almost credit card rates of up to 14%. The Qatar deal is under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office and the Financial Services Authority. But we think the Abu Dhabi side of the deal raises questions too about Barclays' relationship with a Middle Eastern sheikh.
You might not have heard of the man named as the main Abu Dhabi investor, Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan. But you will have heard of his other big British investment, Manchester City.
Sheikh Mansour fronted a takeover of Man City a few months before he turned his attention to Barclays. Here he is meeting the players, but he's kept a very low profile in the UK.
So I want you to tell me what you know about Sheikh Mansour.
He owns City?
Just that he's a good supporter of City, that's all we know, really.
I just know that he's a very wealthy person and he's doing a fabulous job here.
Don't know too much about his investment in this country, other than the stuff he did with, was it Barclays Bank, where he helped bail them out, rather than them having to go to the government. So I know that he made a bit more cash on that one.
Sheikh Mansour is a member of the ruling family in Abu Dhabi. Back in 2008, Barclays told the world the sheikh was giving it more than £3 billion. Shareholders were told the same thing and voted to accept the deal. But Panorama has noticed something odd. It was buried deep in paperwork that was issued the day after the shareholders gave their approval.
So, on page 44 of this prospectus, it says that Sheikh Mansour has arranged for his investment to be funded by an Abu Dhabi government investment vehicle, which seems like the Abu Dhabi government was providing the cash and not Sheikh Mansour.
And that's important because although Sheikh Mansour is a member of the ruling family, there's a difference between his money and the government's.
Are they the same?
No, they're not. It's sloppy thinking, this. There's a big difference between them. A member of a ruling family in the Emirates has his own personal life, wealth, activities.
And when we started delving deeper, we found more contradictions in the Barclays paperwork.
Barclays' filings to the US government suggest the Abu Dhabi government is the investor, not Sheikh Mansour. But Barclays' annual report, the document it sends to shareholders, talks about Sheikh Mansour in 2 separate years. And the problem for Barclays is they both can't be right.
Two reports referring to the same date you'd expect to be entirely consistent, because if they're not, that means that there's something wrong, something inaccurate. Every bank is well aware that the annual report is a critical document, and a huge amount of time and attention is put into trying to get all the details correct.
Barclays has now told us the investor was actually the Abu Dhabi government. They've admitted they knew the investor might change, even as shareholders voted for Sheikh Mansour. The banks say that when the change was confirmed, it provided appropriate disclosure. Barclays admits it was wrong to still identify Sheikh Mansour in its annual reports, but says this was simply a drafting error.
So Barclays misled the public and its shareholders over one of the biggest investments in its history. But that is not the only reason why our discovery might be important.
Although Sheikh Mansour's money didn't save Barclays, he did play a crucial role in the deal. He was chairman of the Abu Dhabi investment vehicle that provided the funding. He's a government official. If it turns out Sheikh Mansour profited personally from the deal, it might look like a bribe.
You have to worry not because Sheikh Mansour may or may not be doing something wrong. You have to worry because you may be doing something wrong as a bank.
How big an issue is it to get that right?
It's important because if you're not getting it right, you may be committing a crime.
The Barclays deal offered a lucrative incentive, the chance to buy 758 million shares at a fixed price. Now, we don't know who benefited from these share options, technically called warrants, because Barclays issued them to an offshore company. We do know a few facts. That offshore company was controlled by Sheikh Mansour. It then transferred to the Abu Dhabi government, then an Abu Dhabi official, before eventually ending up back with Sheikh Mansour.
Because it's all offshore, it's impossible to prove whether the Sheikh benefited personally. But our evidence suggests that there are serious grounds to investigate whether he did.
I think red flags seem to have popped up all over the place. And every red flag has to be dealt with. You can't go on with those still unresolved.
And whose responsibility is it to get to the bottom of those issues?
It's Barclays.
We asked Sheikh Mansour and the Abu Dhabi government investment vehicle about the deal, but neither of them would speak to us. Barclays told us the allegations were not justified and that the change in ownership had no bearing on the transaction or required approvals. What we know for certain is that the Sheikh ended up as one of Barclays' biggest shareholders. The bank told us the deal was the correct decision for Barclays, its shareholders, its customers and its clients, as well as for the UK. They never turned to the British taxpayer. Senior executives did waive their bonuses the following year because of the deal, but the bonus culture inside the bank rolled on. Barclays says it's unfair to put this programme out the night before the new chief exec outlines his vision for the future. In a statement, Mr. Jenkins told us, "Unfortunately, I cannot change the past. No one should underestimate our total resolve to make Barclays a better bank." One of his predecessors says things have to change.
I think that trying to put the business on a more solid footing so that it doesn't make these missteps in the future is terrifically important.
But some critics think it's too little too late.
The fall of Barclays from being really the most reputable bank long ago, you lose a reputation that takes hundreds of years to build just in a few years, and it's going to take them a long time to rebuild it.
After so many years of relying on its troublesome investment bank, can Barclays finally end its addiction to bonuses? Next week, as international forces withdraw from Afghanistan, what exactly are we leaving behind?
Try doing that day in and day out, working with child molesters, working with people who are robbing people, murdering them.
Penguins as they have never been seen before. We have a spy in the huddle next on BBC One. Then after the 10 o'clock news, a well-meaning good deed has the Lewis clan in turmoil, being Eileen. Over on BBC Three now, the great romance experiment, Year of Making Love, is getting started.
Isolated. Whole section had about 100 people, including support staff, so there were about 60 people on the front end. They made huge profits.
Much of their work was about finding new ways of avoiding tax.
Some very smart people in the product development team would come up with a tax trick, and the marketing team would cloak it in some kind of rationale. Some tax structuring is common in a lot of banks, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly normal. The issue was...
Down at the bottom here, we've still got our $2.5 billion.
Barclays drew up the whole structure.
It's like some sort of nightmare IKEA map.
Somehow all of this helped Barclays exploit the system and avoid millions in tax.
There's something else here which has got 120 million dividend. And there's Barclays up at the top.
Barclays told us it does not offer condone reason he left, and after he went, the SCM department did expand dramatically.
This company.
We've been given confidential documents which show the shape of one SCM tax avoidance scheme.
Barclays sits there. That's the Luxembourg bank, that's the finance.
Staff lent billions of pounds to a bank in Luxembourg via complex structures and a company in the Cayman Islands. Or support unlawful tax evasion. Where any SCM transaction has UK tax implications, we make full and explicit disclosure to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Inside Barclays Investment Bank, SCM was a closed world, but we've tracked down an insider. As long as we protected his identity, he agreed to tell us about this little-known tax avoidance department.
It was
Canary Wharf was a sort of offshore island, completely divorced from the rest of Britain.
I had a good look at what SCM was doing in my day. The question really was how aggressively it should be grown. My view was it should not be grown very aggressively, because you could only grow it aggressively by pushing the envelope too far.
Now, critics would say that Martin Taylor always opposed a major expansion of the investment bank. It was the main